I have a wife. I have children. The words tear out of him as he drops to his knees in the mud, screaming them at guards who do not care what he's about to lose. No one moves. Thousands of prisoners stare straight ahead. No one dares turn to look. In Auschwitz, drawing attention to another man's suffering could make it your own. Then one prisoner does the one thing that every man in the camp has learned never to do. He steps out of formation. Auschwitz, Poland, 1941. The man who stepped out of line was Franciscan Maximilian Kolbe. He was brilliant enough to earn 2 doctorates by age 25. He could have spent his life as a respected scholar, teaching and writing in safety. He chose something else entirely. Across Europe, factory floors shook beneath the weight of tanks. Rifle factories ran day and night. Millions of young men learned to march in perfect formation, preparing to kill men they had never met. Maximilian looked at the same continent and decided the world needed another army. Only his soldiers would never carry rifles. They carried rosaries instead. Their battlefield was the human soul. He called it the Militia Immaculate, and within a few years it had grown into a publishing apostolate, producing millions of copies each month. Monks who owned nothing, flooding Poland with words instead of weapons. Then, at the height of it all, he walked away. He left behind one of the largest Catholic publishing ministries in Europe, boarding a ship, and sailed to Japan. He arrived knowing no one, speaking none of the language, carrying nothing but the conviction that Christ belonged there too. On a hillside overlooking Nagasaki, he built another monastery from the ground up, in a country that had never heard his name. 3 years later, he returned to Poland to lead the monastery he had left behind. Then the world caught fire. Nazi soldiers were kicking down doors across Poland, dragging families into the street. At Niekopolanów, Maximilian threw a door open in the opposite direction. By the time the occupation settled in, his monastery didn't hold monks anymore. It held thousands of refugees. More than 3,000 refugees passed through those gates, nearly 2,000 of them Jews. Hidden inside walls where the penalty for sheltering even one of them was a bullet for every man inside. Maximilian was arrested that September, released, arrested again in 1941, and this time there would be no release. He was loaded onto a train bound for a place built to make men disappear. The first thing Auschwitz took from him was not his life, it was his name. In its place came a number stitched onto his uniform, 16670. Late one night in July, a prisoner escaped. The man had gone. The punishment remained. For every prisoner who escaped, 10 innocent men would die in a starvation bunker. The guards walked slowly down the line. No trial, no accusations, just a finger, and a life ended. Among the 10 was a prisoner still kneeling in the mud, crying out for the only names that mattered to him anymore. My wife, my children! A prisoner stepped out of the line. Who are you? Why are you out of formation? The commandant shouted. I am a Catholic priest, Maximilian replied. The commandant stared at him. The guards waited. Thousands of prisoners stood motionless, every eye fixed on the exchange, unable to guess what this man could possibly want. Then Maximilian spoke again. Take me in his place. The request was almost impossible to comprehend. He was not asking for lighter work, not asking for mercy, not asking for another assignment. He was asking to enter a bunker from which no one was expected to return, so that a man he had never met could walk away instead. It was not the first great sacrifice of his life. He had left behind the work he loved to begin again as a missionary where no one knew his name. He had turned a thriving monastery into a refuge for thousands fleeing the Nazis. Even inside Auschwitz, he quietly gave away portions of his own bread to prisoners weaker than himself. But every sacrifice until now had left him with tomorrow. This one would ask for everything. His own life. Maximilian walked into the starvation bunker in another man's place. A starvation bunker is built for one sound: despair. Men are locked inside and slowly starved until hunger strips away every trace of hope. That is what the guards expect to hear through its walls. Instead, another sound emerged. Not screams, not curses, not men begging for death. Hymns. The rosary, the voice of a priest leading dying men toward God. One by one, the bodies around him failed. But as their bodies grew weaker, Maximilian prepared something the Nazis could never destroy: their souls. One by one, he heard their final confessions. One by one, he prayed with them. One by one, he prepared them to meet God. The Nazis could starve their bodies, but they could not touch the grace God offered their souls. Maximilian could not save their lives, but he refused to let even one of them face eternity alone. He had spent his whole life pouring out words, sermons, newspapers, doctrine, millions of printed pages. Now, starving to death himself, the only words he had left were spent leading dying men toward God. After 2 weeks, he was the last of the 10 still breathing. On August 14, 1941, the guards ended his life with an injection of carbolic acid. The next day was the Feast of the Assumption, the day the Church celebrates the Blessed Virgin Mary being taken body and soul into heavenly glory. While his body was carried into the crematorium, his soul entered the glory promised by her Son. On the feast that honors Mary's own entrance into heaven, the man who had entrusted his life to her completed his own pilgrimage home. Years earlier, as a 12-year-old boy praying before an image of the Blessed Virgin, Maximilian saw her holding 2 crowns, one white, one red, one for purity, one for martyrdom. She asked which one he desired. Both, he answered. He could not have known what that answer would cost him one day. On the Feast of the Assumption, both crowns were finally his. In 1982, Pope John Paul II declared Maximilian Kolbe a saint, a martyr of charity. Among the thousands gathered in St. Peter's Square sat an elderly man surrounded by his family. To almost everyone there, he was simply another pilgrim. 41 years earlier, he had stood in another crowd, not in St. Peter's Square, in Auschwitz. His name was Franciszek Gajowniczek. He was the very man for whom Maximilian Kolbe had laid down his life. In 1941, Franciszek was 39 years old. He went home. He grew old beside his wife he thought he would never see again. He lived long enough to hold grandchildren who would never have existed had a stranger not stepped out of line in Auschwitz. Now at 80 years old, he stood in St. Peter's Square watching the church proclaim to the world what he had known for 41 years, that the priest who died in his place was a saint.